Capital One's tech team isn't just talking about multi-agentic AI. They already deployed one, Chat Concierge for car shopping. Their tech team built in self-reflection with live API checks to help buyers find a car they love. That's how they stack. That's technology at Capital One.
Welcome to this special custom episode from FASTCO WORKS in partnership with Williams. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay. Joining me is Jaclyn Presnal, Vice President of New Energy Ventures at Williams. In this episode, we discuss how her team is developing solutions to navigate growing power demand, including carbon capture and solar farms, and how strategic partnerships and innovation will shape the future between technology and natural gas. Jaclyn, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
All right, well, before we get into the specific initiatives that you're working on, I want to start with a question that's near and dear to Fast Company's heart, like really going back to the beginning of Fast Company, when we were all about change agents. And how do you lead teams inside of large organizations that are nimble, that are innovative, that are potentially disruptive, and succeed in transferring those ideas to larger organizations? So what is your team like, and how do you operate inside such a massive company that is not making software, but dealing with huge CapEx and huge energy projects?
So Williams has been around for over 100 years now. The company actually started building sidewalks in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and has evolved from there. Over those 100 years, almost 120 years now, there's been a variety of different innovative efforts, but I get to help lead the current innovation efforts at the company, which is really exciting. So if you think about startup technologies, we were really stood up about 5 years ago, focused on how do we make sure that we're helping the company to decarbonize and meet our climate commitment goals. So natural gas infrastructure is clean, affordable, and reliable, and a very important part of the energy mix for the U.S. as well as for the globe. But there are things that we can do that are going to help decarbonize that value chain. And so my team was stood up to really focus on how we were going to be able to do that. In addition to decarbonization, we're also able to look at how do we expand outside of our base business into new business lines like power innovation. And so it's just really exciting times right now. We're well-capitalized, Fortune 500 company, but we get to be nimble and quick like a startup organization and really figure out what are the right solutions to put in place today to help solve some of the most complex challenges.
All right, well, before we dive into the specific projects you're working on, again, to follow up on that is, where's your team located inside the organization? How do you ensure that you're not like the tiny innovation team that is off the org chart and is effectively ignored? Like, who are your champions, or how do you make sure that you are heard and that the projects you're working on and investing in then become part of the business as a whole?
Sure. So at Williams, we have what we call our Corporate Strategic Development Group, and it really is an overarching team that crosses all organizational boundaries. It's focused on strategy, market intelligence, innovation, as well as corporate communications and other things. And it has our Sequent Energy Management business. So the whole organization within CSD, or Corporate Strategic Development, is really focused on collaborating across the base business. And so we're always pulling into the leaders of the different operating areas or the different franchises to understand what are their issues and challenges and how do we help solve those. But then as we're building projects, we're helping to bring them along as well to show how the projects that we're developing are going to add either growth or opportunity to their business as well. And so there's a lot of, one of the core values and beliefs for the company is around collaboration. It seems like we say that word over and over again, but it really is important, especially when you are trying to build something new. You have to make sure that stakeholders are coming along with you and making sure that you're sharing information, but also helping them understand how they can contribute to that success as well. So I'd say you want to make it fun. Everyone likes to go to work and do something fun. And I think the more that you can do that and create that sense of urgency and ownership and responsibility, not just driven out of the group that I lead directly, but across the whole organization, I think that's where you're going to come up with the best outcomes.
Let's dive into some of these projects. You know, one of the classic items in the Innovator's Dilemma in Christensen's book is the idea that incumbents rarely want to invest in potential disruptants out there. They'd rather stick to their knitting in there. But you've made heavy investments into solar and you're looking into renewables. And I'm curious, like, the scale of those projects and how that's feeding back into the organization. How do you approach like solar and wind and some of these more renewable sources?
So when we stood up the New Energy Ventures team, we really set up several different verticals, and solar and battery technology was one of those that we felt was complementary to the natural gas infrastructure that we own and operate today. So we have invested in several different solar and battery projects. The first ones actually went into service earlier this year. So we have 2 solar battery installations. They're in Pennsylvania, so in the PJM market territory. And we really developed those. We looked at areas across the company where we had high electricity demand for our own use, and then developed projects where we would be able to offset the electric costs that we have on those assets, but also create opportunities to lower the overall emissions profile. So these projects, it's roughly 20 megawatts on each project. And that's combined from the solar and battery. So about 12 megawatts from a solar perspective on each of those. And they're cookie cutter projects at 2 of our Transco compressor stations. And that opportunity, I'll say, was not without its challenges. When you're trying to do something new within a large organization, there were a lot of challenges as far as how are we going to be able to develop this project and get the support that we need. But I go back to those stakeholders, being able to communicate to the operating area there, what is the benefit of us being able to build this project and have it there for them to operate. One of the benefits that's kind of unique is that we also set this up as it's photovoltaic agriculture as well. So we have it set up that we're using sheep to come in and graze around the solar panels. So it's something from a normal, compressor station operations day-to-day life is not something that the team is used to, but this is one of those added benefits that when you help the New Energy Ventures team be successful in getting these projects done, then there's new fun things like having sheep that you're going to be responsible for a period of time that come in and help us with the maintenance. So those are just 2 examples of smaller scale solar and battery projects. We have a larger scale project in Florida, and this is where, if you think about Williams having an operating history well over 100 years, there's several businesses that we are no longer active in, but we may have land that is still from those past or discontinued operations. So we actually have 5,000 acres in the middle of Florida, right in between Tampa and Orlando, a well-trafficked corridor. And the team, when we stood up the solar team, was really looking at where do we have available land that it makes sense to develop these solar projects, because solar energy takes a lot of land. There's a large footprint associated with that. And this turned out to be a great location for us. So it was technically an abandoned or a discontinued operations phosphate mine. Great land, had been used as farming land, grazing cattle there for some time. And we looked at the available space, the location, and the needs of that community there. And Lakeland Electric, who's our customer, they needed incremental generation. And we had the ability to develop a utility scale solar project for them that's now in execution and will be in service late next year, maybe early 27. But we're really targeting the end of next year. So the city there is very excited about the project. We're excited. It lets us do something with land that was just sitting there, not being fully utilized. And then it also helps contribute to lower emissions from an energy perspective.
Yeah, I had not fully appreciated the role of sheep in the energy transition, but I'm going to rethink that. And also, yeah, it's really exciting, the idea of all the brownfield sites in America that could be repurposed for solar. I wouldn't have thought a phosphate mine would be eligible for that. Well, I do want to focus on your core business, because I think for most listeners, the idea of fossil fuels as innovative is not something that crosses their mind. Like, it's a business that's over a century old and you think these processes are refined. But I know from writing for Fast Company 15 years ago, a lot of the smart city technologies, sensors and development were focused on oil and gas exploration and sort of these other areas. You built a whole platform in this. We're using satellites, using all sorts of stuff to monitor your operations. Tell us about the sort of quasi-digital twin you built at Williams and its natural gas.
Yeah, so part of the New Energy Ventures team is focused on actual corporate venture capital, which is investing into startup companies to help commercialize their technology. And we took a series of investments that we stitched together, and that became our next-gen gas platform. So what we did is we invested in first a software platform, and that is Context Labs. And that software platform is where we're feeding all of these different sources of information and creating that digital twin of our full asset infrastructure. And then within that software platform, we're connecting it to our internal data that we already have today through different monitoring technologies, but we're also layering in incremental technologies. So we invested in satellites so that we have the ability to survey our infrastructure way up in space. There's actually hyperspectral cameras that are able to help detect where you may have methane emissions, or they're also used for operational purposes as far as helping us to survey our pipelines. Then we invested in sensors and cameras so that you have on-site real-time monitoring of your assets. And one thing that I think is really important for people that aren't as familiar with the natural gas industry is that we want to keep the gas in the system, right? So as much as we can invest and make sure that we are containing the methane in the pipeline, we want to actually use that as fuel and create energy from it, not to have fugitive emissions. So these things that we're doing as far as cameras and sensors, laser technology, the satellites that we have, they're all in place to help us monitor and ensure that everything is operating as it should. And that just creates more value for us and more value for our customers as well, because there's more gas that can be delivered. And the interesting thing about NextGen Gas is that we are the first midstream company that is actually providing that transparency across our value chain. So when we talk about NextGen Gas, it's the ability to look at all the way from the wellhead where natural gas is produced through our midstream infrastructure, delivered to the end use, and give the transparency of what the emissions are associated with a molecule of natural gas. So we're the first in the industry to do this. I think it's really exciting. This is the direction that the industry is going to be going. And I think when you think of the future and you layer on different concepts as far as like how can technology and AI help us, if you have the ability to attach an emission profile to a molecule of natural gas, we're going to be able to figure out how do you get natural gas delivered at the lowest cost and the lowest emission profile possible. And that's how we're going to be able to optimize the natural gas infrastructure over time. And so I think it's really exciting. It takes time to build this out, but we've made a lot of progress to date and have had success in being able to position this as part of the future solutions.
Interesting. Well, taking that further, so in terms of keeping it in the system and reducing, off-gassing, et cetera, there's, of course, this larger picture where the International Energy Agency is suggesting in its new report that peak fossil fuels are still decades away. We're going to have this energy paradigm where the transition is not from fossil fuels to renewables. It's just all of the above, more and more and more, which means carbon sequestration is going to be key to this. I'm curious, how your group is approaching this, too, because I guess following it from afar, it seems like sequestration is promising. It's worked at a handful of pilot levels, but there's no really systemic effort to that one, too. So how are you approaching that? Because if we are going to burn fossil fuels for decades to come, that's going to be essential to meeting anything like our climate commitments.
Yes, and I completely agree with the energy of the future is an all of the above solution. It's really going to take everything if we are going to even attempt to achieve the demand that is out there and make sure that we are supporting not just our own economy, but developing economies as well. So I do think that carbon capture and sequestration is going to be a very important tool for that future. The reason why we haven't seen it reach a level of scale is that we have been through the pilot phase, right? So there are different pilots that are in service that are able to help prove out the technology. That's not the challenge. The challenge is really the economics behind it. And just like solar and wind, renewable resources, carbon capture and sequestration does require incentives in order to make the economics work. And so the 45Q tax credit, which was created by the Investment Reduction Act and then continued to be supported in the One Big Beautiful Bill, is really the key enabler for how are we going to be able to scale this technology. I do think that over time, we're going to be able to get to the point where those incentives can reduce. But for now, in order to get this, I'd call it somewhat nascent technology across the line to be able to scale it and prove it, we are going to need that support from the incentives. I think it's important, though, that people support that because this is a huge opportunity. If you think about where we have carbon dioxide emissions, if you think about There's the fugitive emissions. There's just the emissions that you get either pre-combustion or post-combustion from natural gas processing or from natural gas generation. There's an opportunity and the technology exists for us to be able to capture that and sequester it. It's just a matter of being able to get those costs down so that it becomes an economic solution long term. And so that's one thing that my team is focused on. We have our first project in Louisiana that we're doing capture of our own emissions. We have amine, gas treating. It's a common part of the midstream industry for those that aren't familiar with it. But normally, when you think of how we operate, those emissions are just vented to atmosphere. And what we're doing is we're actually capturing those emissions, and then we're going to be transporting them to a Class 6 sequestration well where those emissions are now going to be permanently sequestered, long-term permanent storage. So this is the first project that we've reached final investment decision on and have been progressing. And the scale of that is roughly 750,000 metric tons per year. So it's a very sizable CO2 project for the company. And I think that the opportunity continues to be vast as far as where you're able to aggregate emission sources and recreate that midstream infrastructure of the ability to just gather those emissions and then permanently sequester them. You can also use those for enhanced oil recovery, and many upstream customers of ours or other producers are using that for enhanced oil recovery as well.
Listeners, we might have to put in the show notes like a complete diagram of the oil and gas industry here, because I do love the terminology of upstream, midstream, downstream in terms of how the whole ecosystem fits together. But one thing I want to ask is in terms of, the speed and scale of delivering these projects. There's a lot of talk these days about abundance. The idea that, we really need to deregulate certain areas to build housing or energy infrastructure. The last administration, there was a lot of discussion about permitting reform. I remember, Senator Manchin talking a lot about that. How are you approaching that in terms of accelerating the speed of this? Because that is, the current administration is very invested in increasing energy infrastructure as well. So where are the biggest bottlenecks of this in terms of ramping this up and deploying this? And, what corners can we cut and what corners can't we cut?
Yeah, I'd say that from a Williams perspective, you can't cut any corners. We've been around for over 100 years, and we've done that and have been successful because we do follow the guidelines and regulations. But I think it's important, and you ask a great question, like what are those challenges and what is preventing us from being able to build infrastructure at the speed that is required to meet the demand? And I think right now the whole AI race and revolution is a key example of this. From natural gas pipeline perspective, we've had projects where it can take 3 to 4 years just to permit the project, but we can actually build that pipeline in less than 12 months. And so this is the challenge that we're struggling with, is the way that the regulations have been set up. There's a very lengthy permitting process, and the ability for that permitting process to be challenged across the lengths of those rights of way that we have to get for the pipeline. So it's linear infrastructure, and you're not just going through, one community. It's many, many states when you're building, a 100-mile pipe or so. And all of those layers of complexity have really prevented us from being able to build incremental infrastructure at the speed that's required. So one thing that my team has been focused on and that Williams has been focused on is how do we make sure that we're developing infrastructure where we can move the fastest? So from a Transco, which is the largest pipeline that goes all the way from the Gulf Coast to New York City. That's part of our base business. That's part of that regulated pipeline infrastructure. And we have to go through all of the FERC regulated permitting to get there. But there are opportunities along our pipelines, along other pipelines, where you can add incremental opportunities and stay within a certain state. So that's one thing that we've been focused on from a power innovation perspective, is how do we make sure if we have natural gas capacity in a certain location, can we build a pipeline lateral that can then serve power generation? And we're trying to shift to where does that make the most sense versus where do people really want to be? So you've seen, if you think about data centers and all of the convergence of the Northern Virginia area, you now have a concentration that's really hard to continue to expand there, really hard to build incremental generation from an electric perspective, but also difficult to get incremental gas to support that generation. We are developing those projects and very excited about them, but it's something that's going to be in service in 2030. So what can we do today to help meet those demands? And that's really what we've been focused on. If you look at our Ohio projects, it's how do we deliver that speed to market and take advantage of regulatory regimes that are favorable for permitting and business and work within those regulations to help get these projects delivered with the speed that's required.
Well, I would say you touched upon a bunch there. And for listeners, if you made it this long, this is where we're going to discuss AI. It's like I feel like we've saved dessert here to just get into this. So two things stand out to me. One, Goldman Sachs just put out a slide at least showing that basically just the power needs of NVIDIA processors alone will grow from 0.7 gigawatts at the advent of ChatGPT to, they estimate, 24.6 gigawatts by the end of 2026, which we were discussing beforehand is basically the equivalent of Houston to build out there. What does that entail from a Williams perspective in terms of the how do you build that energy infrastructure to go with? Because it's one thing for me to read that Meta, for example, is building a data center the size of the island of Manhattan, but how are they going to power that? And that's exactly the question that you have to grapple with. So what does it look like? What does this actual AI archipelago of data centers look like from an energy perspective, from pipelines to the on-site supply of energy, cooling, et cetera there? What's happening?
So it's been really interesting over the last, say, 2 years or so. We have the confluence of technology, energy, innovation, but also the legislative and regulatory ability to actually get all these projects moving forward. So it's really about making sure that we're developing those projects where it makes the most sense. So to support these projects, if you have like AWS or Meta developing a large data center campus, then you have the infrastructure that's going to be required to support that. Historically, when they're building these, they've been able to leverage the electric grid or utility power to provide the services that are required. Well, the utilities, about 2 years ago or so, reached their capacity as far as their traditional model is to plan for 5 years in advance. And so planning for we need power in the next 12 to 18 months doesn't fit within that current planning trajectory. And so we have to accelerate all of these conversations to figure out, okay, where do the data centers need to be? How is the generation going to be coming behind? Well, not even behind that. How is the generation going to be there before the data center so that they're up and running? And then how do you get the natural gas infrastructure to power those data centers? And I said natural gas, but it's in all of the above, right? So you've got solar, wind, you have nuclear capacity, you have gas generation that are all trying to accelerate to meet this growing demand. And so it really is working through all of those different layers to make sure that the power is available and there for the customers that they need it. But the scale is impressive. You mentioned the size of Manhattan for the Meta project, and that's a great example of them working with the utility in Louisiana, Entergy, in order to develop that project. And that's a great example of how we're all having to work together to solve these problems. And I think that then there's layers of how can Williams participate in this type of growth as well. And so looking at, again, how do we figure out the best location to build these projects and help shift the demand to those areas. And that'll allow us to move faster.
Well, that is the question. It's been interesting over the last year in conversations with your Williams colleagues, with the folks at Lumen laying bandwidth. I was at an industrial real estate conference last week in Toronto, and they were all working on projects in Ohio. The conversation that comes up always is it's the energy is the bottleneck. Mark Zuckerberg himself has said this. Like, that's the defining. So with that in mind, from your perspective, what are the winners of AI? What are going to be the winning geographies of this, where the data centers are going to be built and where all of this is headed in that regard? Because, yeah, it's been focused on Northern Virginia, as you mentioned, because that's historically where the big internet switching station is. But it seems like there's going to have to be new clusters of this. And where do you sort of see that happening?
Absolutely. I think it's going to be important that there's new clusters that are developed. And I also hope that those clusters are going to be developed in the United States, right? Because this isn't just a U.S.-centric race. Like, we are racing the globe right now. And so where that's going to happen, it's going to be in areas where you have existing infrastructure in place that can support this growing demand. And that infrastructure not just, natural gas, the fiber that's required to have that connectivity. There's a lot of, I call them like arteries already in place today. A lot of those follow our natural gas infrastructure because in the innovative past of Williams, one thing that I didn't mention already is that we actually had a telecommunications business well over a couple decades ago where we were installing that fiber along the rights of way of our pipeline. And I think that positions us really well for the ability to deliver these projects. So it's where you have the infrastructure, gas, fiber, solar, wind, whatever it may be, as well as where do you have permitting environments that are going to be friendly towards building. And so there are several states that over the last legislative session passed legislation such as behind the meter support so that you can go in and develop projects outside of the regulated utility to help meet that speed to market. And then eventually you can tie that into the grid and actually help grid resiliency long term by adding incremental generation. And I think that's the exciting thing that we're working with today is where are those states and areas where you're going to have the ability to have the whole ecosystem working together, the utility as well as co-located or on-site generation that's being used for these large load customers, and then the ability to make sure that the costs are not increasing for the broader consumer, right? And so I think that this is a fine balance of trying to figure out what are those right levers that we need to use in order to make sure that we're able to win the race, that we build the generation and we don't get in our own way to do that, but also do so in a clean, affordable, and reliable way, and that we don't impact the general consumer with the overall cost increase. Because as you mentioned, if we're talking about 26 gigawatts or 30 gigawatts that's going to be added, this is an incredible scale. Like the amount of building that needs to happen in order to get that done is unprecedented. We haven't seen electric generation increase over the past 2 decades. I've seen projections showing that 26 gigawatts from NVIDIA, overall electric growth is projected to be about 85 gigawatts. That's not just for data centers, but that's just electrification, right? Because it's not just data centers. We've been pushing and pushing, electrify everything. So that's incremental demand that we have to meet. And we all have to work together to figure out how we're going to be able to achieve that.
All right, so we're about out of time here. The beauty of taping this at the festival is that we're about to jump into a discussion where we're going to have this larger conversation about, digital transformation with AI and how energy ties into this nexus and how it all comes together. My question for you in closing is what are business leaders missing about this entire conversation here about maybe how to harness AI, but maybe thinking about these larger infrastructure needs and where the direction of business is going? What do you think they should know? What are the generalizable lessons from your experience, both working inside Williams, leading this team, but also about these larger transitions that are happening?
I really think that we need to focus on the conversations and sharing information, because if you only ask for one part of the solution, that's what the team is going to be focused on. But if you can talk broadly about what is the challenge that we are trying to solve, that's where I think if you get all the right people in the room and the right people in the conversation, you can come up with really innovative solutions that are going to deliver the best speed, the best cost, the best reliability, or best sustainability, and really having those conversations to figure out what is that right solution, but also do it with the speed that is required. I think it's just a matter of being transparent, right? You have to be open about what you're trying to solve for, and you have to be open about what you can deliver as well. And so getting those conversations moving, I think, is an important component for all business leaders at this point in order for us to be well positioned.
Great. Jaclyn, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Greg.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. This custom episode is produced by FASTCO WORKS in partnership with Williams. I'm Greg Lindsay. Our producer is Blake Odom, and our editor is Chris Allen.